Welcome to TCA's Year 7 lesson about the Peasants' Revolt. You should have already completed a starter activity as part of the team's live introduction. Let's make a start on the lesson. Remember to pause the video where I ask you to in order to complete the tasks. Today's lesson is going to be all about the Peasants' Revolt, which happened in 1381. We are going to look at what started the Peasants' Revolt, why it happened, and how the king dealt with it. But before we can look at these things, we need to answer 3 questions. What was a peasant? Think back to your lesson on the feudal system. What is a revolt? And what reasons might the peasants have to be angry? Answer these 3 questions in your book. Pause the video here to give yourself time to answer these 3 questions. So then, let's have a look at answering the questions. What was a peasant? That is someone of low social rank who generally works in agriculture. Remember, from our lesson on the feudal system, the peasant sits at the bottom of the pyramid. Above the peasants is the knights, above the knights is the barons, and at the top of our pyramid we have the king, who controls everyone below him. The feudal system was created by William the Conqueror as his way of controlling the English population and making sure that everybody knew their place. What is a revolt then? Well, a revolt is to take violent action against the government/ruler. You are rebelling, and that's exactly what the peasants did in 1381. They rebelled against the king. What reasons would the peasants have then to be angry? Well, the Black Death had made them realise just how poor they were, and they were angry about their poverty, and they didn't like the fact that people like the barons and the kings had more than them, and they wanted everything to be equal. Check these answers against the ones that you have written down in your book. Who are the main characters in this revolt? On the side of the rebels, we have Sir John Ball. He was a priest from Kent who believed that it was wrong that some people in England were very rich while others were very poor. Ball's church sermons criticised the feudal system. He regularly spoke to people, criticising the king, and he criticised the poll tax, but more on that later. Also on the rebel side, we have the leader of the revolt, Wat Tyler. He was a follower of John Ball, and he felt it was unfair that the peasants had to pay the same amount of money in the poll tax as the rich, especially considering that the peasants earned less. The rebels were going up against the authority, which was King Richard II. He became king when he was 10 years old. Due to his young age, the king surrounded himself with advisors to help him make decisions. When the revolt took place, King Richard was only 14 years old. What were the causes of the peasants' revolt? There were several contributing factors as to why the peasants felt angry and decided to revolt against the king. 300 years after the Norman conquest, peasants were still poor and they belonged to their lords, with many few having freedoms for themselves. The Black Death in 1348 to 1350 had killed many people. This meant that there was a shortage of workers and wages went up. However, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which set a maximum wage and said that people would be punished with prison if they refused to work for that wage. This meant that despite the demand for workers and the greater availability of land, poor people still stayed poor. Life for ordinary medieval people was strictly controlled by the local lord. The law also allowed the lord to stop his peasants moving for better wages. Coming straight after the Black Death and the consequent shortage of labour, this crushed the peasants' high expectations for their income. The feudal system too had for centuries tied most peasants to the whims of their lord. The lord even had the power to approve any of his peasants as spouses. That means husband or wife. Not surprisingly, it made sense that the peasants wanted things to change. A Lollard priest called John Ball, who became a leader in the revolt, had been preaching to people that they should become individual and that they should throw away the evil lords. He would ask, are people equal? And he would try and whip the peasants up into a frenzy. After 1369, The war against France, which had been going on for over 50 years, was going really badly. This meant that the people started to despise the government, and the government were also struggling to pay for this war. In 1377, Richard II, a boy king of only 10, became the king and his uncle, and because he had advisors helping him, the peasants didn't feel like he was actually running the country. And one of the final reasons why the Peasants' Revolt started was because one of the advisors to the King Richard, John Gort, introduced a poll tax to pay for the war against France. The poll tax had to be paid by everybody over the age of 15, no matter how much money they earned. In March 1381, the government demanded a third poll tax in 4 years. When people tried to avoid paying this, Parliament appointed commissioners to make them pay. All of these were factors that led to the peasants feeling angry, and they decided to revolt against the king. Now that we have looked at the causes of the revolt, we need to order them in a pyramid of importance. I want you to choose 3 causes that will appear on the screen in a moment that you think were the most important reasons why the revolt started. There is no correct answer for this. It's all about what you think is the most important cause. You are going to draw this in a pyramid of importance which looks like this. At the top is going to be your most important cause, here. Next, the second most important cause goes on the bottom left, here. And your third most important cause goes on the bottom right, there. To show you how to do this, I have done an example. Here is the example I'm going to use. I think that the most important reason why the peasants revolted was down to the poll tax and the fact that the peasants had to pay 4p in order to fund the war with France. I don't think this was very fair, so I'm going to put this at the top of my pyramid, as you can see here. Here are the causes of the revolt in the table below. You need to choose your 3 most important causes and create your pyramid in your books. Remember, there is no right answer. This is your opinion. Your most important cause goes at the top, where I have labelled number 1. Your second most important cause goes on the bottom left, where I have labelled number 2. And your third most important cause goes on the bottom right, where I have labelled number 3. Pick from these causes here to put into your pyramid. Pause the video here whilst you complete this task. Now that we have looked at the causes of the Peasants' Revolt, we need to look at how did it start and the events of the revolt itself. With the peasants already unhappy over issues like low wages and people getting whipped up by the preachings of radical priest John Ball, who was demanding that all men should be free and equal, that there should be less harsh laws and a fairer distribution of wealth, the peasants decided to do something about this. On the 30th of March 1381, tax collectors tried to collect a poll tax for the war against France. Remember, this had been going very badly. This was the 3rd time in 4 years that the tax had been collected, and the peasants had had enough. When they refused to pay, the king sent down collectors to make people pay the tax. However, when the collectors tried to collect the tax, the peasants revolted. 3 of the king's collectors were killed by the peasants. Soon, the peasants were in open rebellion against the crown. Word spread, and 60,000 peasants from both Essex and Kent were in open revolt. The peasants realised that they needed a leader, and they chose Wat Tyler, a former soldier, to be their leader. You are now going to look at what happened during the revolt. On the next slide is going to be a video all about the Peasants' Revolt. Watch the clip and make some notes about what happened. Think about, what did the peasants do? Who did they meet whilst they were revolting? And how did it end? Here is the video that you are going to be watching. Whilst this clip is on, please make some notes about what happened during the revolt. Think about who was involved. What did the peasants do? Where did the peasants
So far in this journey, I've completely ignored the vast majority of the English people, the peasants. Throughout these long centuries, they were effectively powerless.
England had always been an agrarian nation. Its wealth was in the land. But the peasants whose job it was to extract that wealth were kept themselves in poverty, unable to leave their villages without permission, tied in service to the local lord. They were little better than slaves. What follows is the story of how, in the late 14th century, those peasants rose up against their masters. It's known today as the Peasants' Revolt. This is Cressing Temple in Essex, the county where the Peasants' Revolt began. On the 13th of June, 1381, life on this peaceful manor changed forever.
According to ancient sources, on that day, over 100 peasants stormed Cressing Temple. They sacked the manor, they drank the wine cellars dry, they torched the buildings. All that's left from those days are these impressive medieval barns. And the only reason they're still here is that on that fateful day, they happen to be empty.
These were tithe barns, where peasants came to pay taxes to the local lord. But in 1381, a new tax had stirred people to anger. A poll tax, and everyone paid the same, which struck people as unfair, because a shilling was nothing to a rich man, but for a labourer, it was 2 weeks' pay. The lord of Cressing Temple, Sir Robert Hales, just happened to be the king's royal treasurer, a symbol of this unjust tax. But soon no lord or nobleman was safe. There were uprisings from Somerset to East Anglia, from Yorkshire to Kent.
Pretty soon this was more than a rebellion about tax. In Maidstone, in Kent, the peasants sprung from prison a rabble-rousing priest called John Ball. He'd been thrown out of the church for spreading all sorts of dangerous ideas. He asked, why were some people poor and others rich? Why did some people work the land and others own the land? Why should the poor obey the law when they had no say in the making of those laws? And it's exciting, because what we're reading for the very first time in the pages of English history is a call for what today we'd call democracy.
Why, in the late 14th century, did the peasants for the first time question their own powerlessness? The answer's simple. From 1350, a dreadful plague had swept the nation. Half the population had lost their lives, rich and poor alike. It seemed like a sign from God. We're all equal in the face of death. But also, with the population halved, there were fewer peasants to work the rich men's lands, which meant those that survived could demand a better wage. So now the peasants were calling the shots. And when the powers that be stung them with an unjust tax, they weren't taking it. The peasants from Cressing Temple joined a rebel army marching on London. 50,000 strong, they camped south of the River Thames. And there, they waited for the king to respond to their demands.
The king at the time, Richard II, was just a boy. He was only 14 years old. And he was holed up there in the Tower, which back then was a royal palace as well as a prison. And he decided he had no choice but to confront the rebels, to go to Blackheath to see what they wanted. And so he took the royal barge and he headed downriver towards the peasant camp.
The peasants made it clear that it wasn't the king who was the problem. Their beef was with his advisors, men like Sir Robert Hales. But even so, the boy king showed courage.
The sight that met their eyes when they reached the peasant camp was scary, to say the least. There were rebels filling the shoreline, and from the barge they could hear the anger in their voices as they called out for the arrest of the king's advisors. And so they chose not to land the barge. They turned, they went back upriver, and the rebels were further infuriated by what they took as a royal snub.
What happened next was chaos. The rebels swarmed west. They crossed London Bridge and fell on the city of London. Prisons were thrown open, legal records were burnt. The skyline of London was red with flames.
The tower was meant to be impregnable, but they broke in. Richard wasn't there, but Sir Robert Hales was, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, a man called Sudbury, and they dragged them out, and the crowd executed them both. Apparently they weren't very good at it. It took 8 blows of the axe to chop off Sudbury's head, and then they took the heads and they stuck them on spikes and displayed them on London Bridge, the traditional fate of traitors.
Richard's whole kingdom was in rebellion. Half his troop of royal bodyguards had deserted him. And yet, once again, he set out to face the rebels. The final confrontation took place at Smithfield, on the site of the modern meat market.
What happened? And it's confusing. There are at least 4 different versions of this story. But it seems that Wat Tyler, who was the peasants' leader, dismounted, and he came over to the king's horse and he took his bridle and he spoke to the king with a complete lack of respect, and he laid out the peasants' demands. What he wanted, he said, was a new Magna Carta, declaring that all men under the king were equal. And what Richard did, and this was extraordinarily brilliant, was he simply agreed with Tyler. He took the wind out of Tyler's sails. He diffused the crowd's anger. And Tyler went back to his horse. And there was a pregnant pause, and no one quite knew what was going to happen next. But then one of the king's men threw out an insult, and Tyler spun back round, and there was a scuffle, there was a fight, and the knife went in. And that was when it could have turned ugly. The crowd might have butchered the king, butchered the king's men. Instead, Richard reclaimed his authority. He seized the moment. He rode over to the crowd and he said, "You shall have no other captain but me." And that was it. The crowd broke up. The crisis was over.
Of course, Richard never did keep his promises. There was to be no Magna Carta for the common people. Instead, he gave orders that the leaders of the rebellion should be caught and strung up on gibbets. Why remember a failed revolt? Because in the language of men like John Ball, you glimpse for the first time a dream of democracy, of equality. For that dream to become a reality would take another 500 years.
You've just watched the video about what happened during the revolt. I'm going to go over some key points. If you haven't got these points, please add them to yours in your book. So the rebels marched to London and their numbers reached about 60,000. The priest John Ball, who had been one of the leaders of this revolt, was imprisoned for speaking against the king. The rebels freed him and he continued to preach his message of equality to them, inspiring them further. The king's commissioners were attacked when they tried to collect the poll tax. They were even beheaded and their heads were put on poles to send a message to the king. The rebels were soon joined by others, for example, the poorer people of London. They were led by people who would have been important in their villages. They also sent letters around the countryside calling for more people to join them. On the 13th of June, someone opened the gates of London and the rebels entered. Once the rebels had entered the city, they attacked houses of Richard's advisors, including using dynamite to blow up Savoy Palace, which was the home of John Gaunt, one of the advisors to the king. Peasants also broke into the Tower of London. This is the only time this has ever been done, and they executed Simon Sudbury, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. This took 8 blows. On the 15th of June, Richard went to Smithfield to meet with the rebel leader, Wat Tyler, to try and end this revolt. Let's have a look at what happens next. What should Richard do then? I want you to imagine that you are one of King Richard's advisors. You are going to meet with him to discuss what to do about this revolt. What would you advise the king to do? Richard was in a very tricky situation, as he was only 14 at the time of the Peasants' Revolt and relied heavily on advisors to tell him what to do. Around him, London was full of peasants, and many of them were rampaging through the streets. Several houses were on fire. Important royal officials, including the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Chancellor of England, had been killed, along with over 100 other people. I am now going to talk you through the options that Richard could do. Here are some of the options that Richard could choose from. He could give the peasants what they want. Wat Tyler, their leader, is not only demanding freedom for all men, but also that the church land should be given to the people. As king, you could give the peasants what they want. Richard could also decide to fight it out with the peasants. He could call on the Londoners to support him. Remember that most of the population of London at this time were peasants. Richard could also flee from London to somewhere safe and ignore what was happening. Or he could trick the peasants and play for time. He could pretend to give the peasants what they want and persuade them to go home. He could then come up with something else later on. Or Richard could do something else. What other ideas do you have? In your books, I would like you to write what you would advise Richard to do and explain why. Pause the video here to give yourself time to complete this task. Let's have a look at what Richard actually did. On the 14th of June, Richard bravely went to Mile End and met a group of rebels. They demanded that the law should be less harsh, the church's wealth should be given to the poor, and there should be no lords at all, and all men should be free and equal. The mayor of London attacked Wat Tyler, and as he died, Wat Tyler ordered the rebels to attack. But Richard stepped forward and said, "You should have no captain but me. Just follow me to the fields without, and then you can have what you want." He promised to abolish the feudal system. The peasants trusted him, and he went home. Richard, however, did not keep his promises. He then used the army to stop the revolts, and hundreds of rebels were hanged, including John Ball. How well do you think King Richard dealt with the Peasants' Revolt? I want you to write a paragraph about how well you think King Richard dealt with the Peasants' Revolt. Do you think that he dealt with it really well, that his decision to promise the peasants what they wanted but then later to betray them was a good idea? Or do you think it went quite well? Perhaps promising the peasants what they wanted was a good idea to get them to go home, but Richard shouldn't have attacked them afterwards? Or do you think that actually what King Richard did was not very good and he didn't deal with the revolt very well at all? In red on the slide, I have given you a sentence starter. Remember, you need to explain why you think this. Write this in your books. Pause the video here to give yourself time to complete this paragraph.